This is the Waupac Area Public Library's Lunch and Learn.
And then today, our Lunch and Learn speaker is Doreen Post, and she's going to talk about her time on the Platte River in Nebraska, where she studied cranes. So I'll turn it over to you, Doreen. Thank you.
Hello. How many of you have driven across Nebraska on Interstate 80? Oops. There. How exciting was that? Some people call the drive across central Nebraska the most boring 200 miles in North America. But there are millions of birds that think otherwise, including about 500,000 sandhill cranes, millions of ducks, and geese that are really beyond counting. They all stop over in south central Nebraska each spring on their northward migration. And here's the reason for the huge influx. There's Nebraska right there. That's with the boring line across the middle that we've been driving on. So this is the Central Flyway. This is the migration route that birds use. And when we're talking about waterfowl and geese, many of them spend the winter time in Mexico and along the Gulf Coast and sometimes over into the Southwest. And they all funnel into this little narrow area of Nebraska where the habitat is good on the river and in the wetlands before fanning out from the Hudson Bay all across the Arctic, and some sandhill cranes, in fact, even migrate all the way over to Siberia. It's a spectacular migration, and I was going to write for you about a description of what it's like, but then I thought, I already wrote that. So I'm going to read you a little passage that's just an introduction from my book, and this describes an evening that I spent in an observation blind on Rose Sanctuary. Their voices arrive first. A distant, soft-edged trill rolls toward the quiet gray river. Soon a flock of birds flying in a lazy V formation materializes in the southern sky. As it flies closer, as the voices grow louder and sharper, each gray bird becomes distinct, its neck outstretched, legs trailing behind. I raise my binoculars and watch the slow sweep of wings, the upward flick of wingtips. After 10 months' absence and a day-long flight, 200 sandhill cranes are announcing their return to the Platte River. Their voices rise in pitch and intensity as they approach, as if they were elated to be here at last. Or perhaps it is only I who am elated. The flock skims across the channel toward the North Bank meadow. The V collapses as the birds cup their wings in 6-foot arcs that tip, glide, and tip again while cranes fall like pattering rain. This is how spring arrives at the Platte, not with the flip of a calendar page, but from little clouds blown in on a southerly wind. The first sprinkles began weeks ago, but by early March, every day ends in a steady shower of cranes. A second bugling flock glides into view, then a third, then more and more. Flocks coming in from the south are new arrivals. Others approach from north and west from cornfields where they have been feeding since morning. They drift down to the meadow, smooth as smoke. Just before they drop out of sight beside the streamside brush, the pale undersides of their wings flash golden in the late afternoon light. The sun sinks lower in the sky. All around, black tendrils appear to be rising from the horizon, interweaving, drifting nearer, converging on the river. Flocks of Canada geese and white-fronted geese trade back and forth above me in search of an evening roost. Meanwhile, cranes continue pouring by the hundreds into the north meadow. Now come the snow geese, 300, 400, 1,000, in a glittering web that unravels across the sky. Bugles, honks, and squeaks blend in a steady low-level din that washes across the river. Each passing flock sounds like a wind gust that swells to a roar as it approaches and then fades away. Twisting clouds of cranes begin to rise from the meadow. They swirl for several seconds and fill the air with piercing bugles. The cranes spill down in waves, landing first on sandbars and then wading into the water to make way for those who follow. A great roar rises downstream, and within moments the sky is churning with dark and white geese up above, all around, swarming toward the sunset. Above the waiting cranes, a fluttering gray and white blizzard of 10,000 geese piles up, hundreds of feet in the air. An invisible floor slides out from under them. They drop down, filling the river, obscuring the water. The last sliver of sun dips below the earth's rim, and above it, stacked bands of orange and blue are strewn with black flecks, each fleck a bird flying toward this river. The flecks stretch on, disappearing in the distance. In the thickening darkness, trumpeting, flapping silhouettes rain down onto the river all around the blind, all around one solitary human. Gradually, the fluttering storm abates. Minutes pass. The voices grow calm. And finally, we are all still. Well, word has gotten out about the Platte River. So in addition to all of those migrating birds, thousands of humans now visit the Platte and the surrounding areas each spring. So it might seem strange if I told you that as recently as the early 1970s, things looked pretty bleak for the Platte River. The habitat might have disappeared while nobody was looking. Nobody, that is, except Chuck Frith, a wildlife biologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Grand Island, Nebraska. One day a report landed on his desk. It was an environmental analysis of a planned irrigation project called the Mid-State Reclamation Project. So Chuck's job at the Fish and Wildlife Service was that he was responsible for evaluating the effect that water development projects, that means like irrigation projects, dams, reservoirs, and so forth, the effect that these projects would have on wildlife and on their habitat. And this project, I'll just show you where these things are. So here's Kearney, Nebraska. This is the area that we talk about when we talk about the Central Platte River or the Big Bend. This is pretty much the area of sandhill crane habitat. And this is where the project was supposed to remove the water from the river. Ooh, problem. The original plan was to have like 23 reservoirs, some of them large, some of them small, that was going to carry water and store it north of the Platte so that this land up here could be irrigated. Now, somehow everybody, including the Fish and Wildlife Service, thought that this was a pretty good idea, except for Chuck Frith. He was supposed to just rubber stamp this project, actually, because the report had been written some years earlier, because the project had been designed in like the 1940s, and just through a series of events had not gotten built up until the late 1960s. But Chuck went to his supervisor and he said, oh, well, there's a problem with this report because it doesn't show the importance of this habitat to sandhill cranes. And his boss said, sandhill cranes? What's the problem? And Chuck really couldn't back up his argument because up to that point, so we're talking late 1960s, 1970, there had been so little research done on sandhill cranes and their use of the Platte River that he didn't have anything to back himself up. So Charles Frith, in his late 30s and married and doing the job that he loved, took a leave of absence from it, so essentially putting everything at risk, and went back to college to get a master's degree at Kearney State University. And the thesis that he was going to write was going to focus on sandhill crane use of the Platte River. Now, as graduate students often do, he started out by writing a bunch of letters to organizations to ask if they would send money to support his research. And one of those letters went to the National Audubon Society, which in those days had a small grants program where they would offer money to people who were doing research work. So Audubon sent $1,000, but that's not all they sent. They also sent their newly hired regional director, a man named Ron Klataski, who was from Kansas, based in Kansas, grew up on a farm. He was a wildlife biologist by training, but an activist by nature. So he got to the Platte River and recognized what a threat was being posed to habitat there. And he set out right away to organize Audubon chapters around Nebraska because at the time there were no Audubon chapters in Nebraska. And he brought those members out to the Platte to see the migration because up until that point, most even bird watchers in Nebraska had not been to the Platte to see the cranes. And he started getting articles published in local magazines and newspapers like this one that was in the statewide publication Nebraska Land. And pretty soon, people started paying attention to the Platte. Now, by the time Chuck Frith was starting his research in around 1970, the Platte was already a very different place from the river that the overland pioneers and the homesteaders had found when they first arrived in Nebraska. The way that the river used to work was that the water started in the Rocky Mountains, and so in the springtime, as the snow melted, it would come pouring down the mountains and across the plains, and would create these big floods that would knock down the trees and carve and scour the banks of the river and carve channels, and then so that you'd have a braided form where the channels were weaving in and out. Low sandbars, small islands, and really a dynamic system where from one year to the next, everything was different, kept vegetation to a minimum, and created what sandhill cranes liked for habitat. Now, what a sandhill crane wants for habitat, and a whooping crane as well, incidentally, is they want shallow water that they can stand in, because that's how they roost. They don't roost in trees because they don't have a toe back here to hold on for perching. So they roost in the water for security, and they want a broad view where they can look out all around, so not obscured by trees and fences and weeds. And then they want meadows along the side of the river, because that's where they get their diet rounded out after eating corn all day long, which is what they do in Nebraska. So just a quick showing you where things are on the Platte River that is known as being a mile wide and an inch deep in the legend and the writings of the pioneers and the homesteaders. And the area that they're generally talking about when they say that is the Central Platte, kind of this area here. Sometimes we call it the Big Bend. You can see why. Sometimes the Central Platte. And this is the area that really has the braided form from about maybe here on across this way. At this point, there are a lot of other rivers that feed in from the northern part of the state, from the Sandhills, and then you get this just like a big wide river, kind of like what we're used to seeing in this part of the country. And farther west, over here, where the river begins in the mountains, these are more like just fast-flowing scenic mountain streams that come in. And then this is the North Platte, South Platte, both actually originate in Colorado, and then they join by the city of North Platte, Nebraska. Okay, so most of the changes that Chuck found when he started his research had actually occurred in the previous 3 decades since the gates had closed on Kingsley Dam. Now, Kingsley Dam formed the Lake McConaughey, which was a reservoir that was providing irrigation water to lands south of the Platte. The other project we were talking about was for lands north of the Platte. Now, there were already lots of major dams on the river at this point. Some of them, like the earliest, Pathfinder here, was built and closed the gates on that, I think, was in 1906, and then we got Glendale Reservoir and Guernsey Reservoir and Seminole Reservoir and a whole bunch of reservoirs on the South Platte as well. But Kingsley Dam and Lake McConaughey right here had the biggest effect for 2 reasons. First of all, it was the largest, it was huge, 1.7 million acre feet, and also because it was closest to the habitat area and so had the most proximate effect. So the biggest changes that occurred were 2 things. Yes, there was a reduction of water because some of it was being used for irrigation, but the most important thing is that we lost the big cycles of floods and drying out because the pattern of the flows had been tempered, so that instead of having big extremes of high and low, you had, and I'm oversimplifying here, but more of a slow, steady trickle. And a slow, steady trickle is good for growing things like cottonwoods and willows, and a lot less good for growing things like sandhill crane habitat. And then the second important thing was that there was a loss of sediment, because the sediment got trapped behind the dams. Now, sediment is like the sand and all the stuff that gets washed down with the river as it's doing its job and creating erosion and carrying everything along, flowing downstream and gets to a reservoir and all of a sudden slows down and plop, all the sediment falls out behind the dam. So that when the water is eventually released, it's clear water, meaning it's hungry water, creating erosion, which cuts down and makes narrow channels, and fails to form these nice sandbars, which cranes like to stand on. You notice actually these look like little islands or sandbars. These are kind of islands of cranes, and what they are doing is they're standing on submerged sandbars so that the water is shallow in these spots where they're standing, and that makes for a pretty good evening roost. So by the 1970s, most of the Central Platte was a corridor of forest. And there were only 3 areas that Chuck Frith referred to as pristine habitat, and in that case it actually just meant pristine enough that the sandhill cranes were still using them and pretty much, for the most part, crowding into those 3 areas. So based on Chuck's recommendation, the National Audubon Society started looking for land in those areas to create a bird sanctuary. And in 1973, National Audubon Society announced an agreement to buy 445 acres of land on the Platte River and scheduled the dedication for the following spring. And another really significant thing happened in 1973, in addition to the 445 acres of habitat being purchased. That was the passage of the Endangered Species Act. Now, in combination with some legislation that we call NEPA for short, which stands for the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, the ESA requires that any project with a federal nexus, and by federal nexus I mean a project that gets federal funding or requires a federal license or a federal permit, any project with a federal nexus had to avoid doing any harm to a threatened or endangered species, endangered like the whooping crane, and also had to avoid harming their habitat, which would have been pretty helpful to the opponents of the Mid-State Reclamation Project, except that up to this point, not enough research had been done, and there had been no designation of the Big Bend or of the Platte River as critical habitat to whooping cranes. So that was not really useful at that point. However, help came instead from a little-known Nebraska state law, which said, okay, so the people that were planning this project to build the big dam created a reclamation district, which is a taxing district, kind of like an airport authority or a harbor authority or something, where they're able to take taxes from local residents in order to fund, in this particular case, to fund the feasibility project. Well, this state law that allowed the creation of the reclamation district said that any public works project that had not begun within a certain period of time of the authority beginning taxation had to resubmit the question to the voter, to the taxpayers for a vote every few years, which kind of makes sense that if you're paying taxes on something and it's not getting built, you ought to be able to say, no thanks, we don't want this anymore, or stop taking taxes from us. So it turned out that 1975 was one of those years, and therefore there was going to be an election in November of that year. Well, on the pro side of this project, we had the reclamation district backed by the United States Bureau of Reclamation, of which this had become a part. So they had this massive budget for a huge public relations campaign, and we're putting ads in the newspaper pretty much every day. The theme for most of them was this: they had big letters that would go across some of the bottoms of the ads, would say, use it or lose it. The implication being that if you were somebody who wanted to irrigate, you better lay claim to this water because otherwise somebody else would. And on the other side of the question was a group with a little tiny budget doing little hand-drawn ads like this one. They didn't have much money, but they were a group of brilliant people in a really diverse coalition. So we had professors, and we had students and Audubon members, hunters and fishermen from the Isaac Walton League, the National Wildlife Federation. They called themselves the Save the Platte Committee. And they were basically first-time activists. None of these people had done activism work before, and so they kind of had to teach themselves grassroots campaigning. Oh, and that also included the residents of the little town of Miller, which would have been inundated if the reservoir, the largest of the reservoirs, were to be built. And perhaps most significantly, a group that called themselves the Mid-State Irrigators. So this was a group of farmers, local farmers, who opposed the project, and led by their charismatic Mark Boland, who would stand up in front of a group and say, I'm just a farmer with an 8th grade education. And then he'd launch into a lengthy explanation of why this project was not necessary and how it was going to affect groundwater levels and how it was going to affect the natural hydrology of the river. And you could tell he was pretty smart, regardless of what his 8th grade education was. The other thing that Mark Boland did was, even though he cared about wildlife, he told the other members of the Save the Platte Committee that he was going to talk about what his audience cared about. So what he said, instead of talking about sandhill cranes, was he said that this project was a big government boondoggle, which it was, and that it was going to take good farmland out of production, which it was going to do. The other crucial thing, I think, is that we had a local man, a local farmer, who was talking about doing conservation work or doing what was right in the area, as opposed to people being able to say, well, it's a bunch of folks that came from the east, and they don't really care about the future of Nebraska. This was a local man who was sharing his opinions, and it worked. On the morning after, or the night of the election, the numbers came in, and Mid-State had been defeated by a vote of 56% to 44%. So it might have been Mark Boland's arguments, or it might have been sympathy for the people of Miller, or concern for the Cranes, or people being fed up with taxes, or all of these. But for the first time, a diverse group of stakeholders had banded together for Platte River conservation. And also for the first time, Nebraskans had said no thanks to an irrigation project. The first time, but it wouldn't be the last. In part because the next watershed event in Platte River conservation came in 1978 when the Fish and Wildlife Service designated the Big Bend of the Platte, again, this is this area here, 51-mile stretch, as critical habitat for the whooping crane. So, if you remember from the Endangered Species Act, that meant that from then on, anybody doing work along the river in this area, if it had a federal nexus, had to avoid harming whooping crane habitat. So this ended up being, the Endangered Species Act being the regulatory hammer that was crucial in the late 1970s and the 1980s, because despite the fact that the Mid-State project had been defeated, there was still a long list of projects that had been proposed, including the Narrows project by Fort Morgan. There would have been a project by Casper, that would be Deer Creek, to provide municipal water there. Another project called Gray Rocks on the Laramie River. Two Forks down by Denver would have been municipal water that would have flooded out a prime trout stream. And then over here was Catherland that would have diverted water pretty much where it was coming back, where it would have come out for the Mid-State project, and it was going to send it way down here to irrigate this land and send it back into a different watershed. Oh, and the Prairie Bend project, so somebody else had proposed another project pretty much identical to the Mid-State project that had just been defeated. There were a few others too, but those are the major ones. But thanks in large part to the Endangered Species Act and the whooping cranes, only one major dam has since been built on the Platte River. And that one project was the one I pointed out on the Laramie River, the Gray Rocks project, which was not a 100% bad thing, because it ended up going to court before the dam was built, and as part of the settlement that allowed the dam to be built, a $7.5 million trust fund was created, and that was used to make an organization called the Platte River Whooping Crane Critical Maintenance Trust, whose name has blessedly been shortened to the Crane Trust since then, so that we can talk about it. And the Crane Trust became one of the major landholding organizations along the Platte, along with the National Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy. And between the three of them, they ended up owning and restoring and protecting about 14,000 acres along the Platte River. So these organizations cooperate in restoring degraded channels and improving habitat, and this is really part of how the process goes. So this is actually a river channel here, and there are all kinds of trees out in the river, and you'll get like heavy earth-moving equipment going out into the channel, removing the trees, and once the trees are all cleared away, using a bulldozer to reshape the channels and flatten out islands that have gotten too big. And so essentially using the sand of the river channel itself to create little sandbars and islands. And they're kind of, it's like just a little sculpture just right there in the river channel. And that creates nesting habitat for least terns and piping plovers, which are also threatened and endangered species, and also and smooths out the banks so that it's good whooping crane habitat as well. And in addition, private landowners along the river through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Partners for Fish and Wildlife program have cooperated in habitat restorations, often because they're following the example that they've seen of the nearby habitat projects done by Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, or the Crane Trust. Some cases it's goose hunters. I've heard stories about goose hunters who would look and see that, there's some restoration had been done over there by the Crane Trust, and they'd see that's how all the geese were flying in. They'd say, "Can you do that over my place?" So little by little, there are greater and greater areas of the Platte River that have been restored. Recognizing, though, that habitat protection is often a matter of getting public support and getting people to care about a place, the Rose Sanctuary in 2003 and also the Crane Trust, likewise in 2003, built visitor centers. And both centers provide a place for people to gather from around the world each spring to witness the sandhill crane migration. They're also a place for education programs that are inspiring generations of youngsters who are growing up in south central Nebraska and will one day be the stewards of this national treasure. And in October of 2006, after a decade of negotiations, the governors of the 3 states in the Platte River watershed, so that's Wyoming, Colorado, and Nebraska, along with the Secretary of Interior, signed an agreement called the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program, which is essentially a master plan for managing the habitat and the water in the Platte River watershed. So instead of fighting over water for irrigation, for cities, for wildlife, what they did was they created a framework for cooperation, and because it was under the auspices of the Department of Interior, it also created a source of funding for habitat work, habitat protection, and research along the river. It's worth noting, though, that the irrigators and the conservation organizations and the governors didn't sign that agreement out of the goodness of their hearts. Like the vetoes on all those dams, the recovery program is driven by the requirements of the Endangered Species Act to protect habitat for the whooping crane and for terns and plovers, but the whooping crane was predominant. So, in a sense, you could say that while the Platte River was protecting the whooping crane by providing habitat, the whooping crane protected the Platte River. I'll touch on a few reasons why I think it's important to know about the history of an obscure irrigation project that never came to be. Because this might all seem like nostalgia now that agreements and long-term plans and laws are in place to protect the Platte River and to protect the endangered species and therefore its habitat. First of all, throughout this talk, I keep describing or mentioning something called habitat, but what we're really talking about when we talk about habitat in the West is water. Water. In more and more of the world, and always west of the 100th meridian, there's never enough to go around, and that won't change. Laws are subject to change. Agreements are subject to change. The climate is subject to change. 45 years ago, the habitat, the water, on the Platte River might have disappeared when nobody was looking. When today, people from around the world are looking. So that creates hometown pride. It also creates a business community that benefits from ecotourism and recognizes the value, the economic value of nature. And both of those are important protections. So I think this story is a reminder that we can all watch over the places where we live, the places we love, including the Platte, but not limited to the Platte. Secondly, finally, to me this story is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming challenges, a few committed people, or even one committed person, can make a difference. Chuck Frith didn't give in when his boss told him to stop causing trouble. Mark Boland, with his 8th grade education, slogged through academic articles and then explained them in plain language to other people. And the Save the Platte Committee, with their hand-drawn ads and their tiny little budget, stood up to the mighty U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. And they won. And the prize is an inheritance, a gift, and an example to the whole world. Now, I left a fair amount of time for questions and discussion because I think this topic sometimes tends to bring that up. So if you have things you'd like to ask about or things you'd like to comment on or experiences you'd like to share, I'd be glad to hear. Yeah.
Any current threats to the Endangered Species Act with our current Secretary of the Interior?
Okay, so yes, the question is whether there are any threats to the Endangered Species Act with our current Secretary of the Interior. And honestly, it's not the Secretary of the Interior that I would be worried about, but there are members of Congress who have proposed changes to the Endangered Species Act. That's not anything new. That's been going on pretty much since the Endangered Species Act was passed, and every time that it was up for renewal and people offering to modernize the legislation. And frequently you'll find that, for example, the Grey Rocks Dam that I mentioned, that was resulted from an out-of-court settlement in the $7.5 million. Agreements like that came to pass because the environmental organizations are often concerned, pretty much all the time, about the political pressure against the Endangered Species Act. So that rather than be really hard and fight all the way and say, no, you can't finish this dam that was already started, and create a lot of negative feelings, they say, okay, go ahead this one time, yeah, we'll take the $700 million. So yeah, that's the long answer. But the short answer is yes, always. Yeah. You did hear that the Wisconsin DNR is considering a hunt on sandhill cranes, and actually this is not the first time in that. I was in Nebraska for 6 years and elsewhere before that, and before I moved away from Wisconsin, so in 1990, I want to say 1999 is the first time that I went to a conservation congress where the question of the sandhill crane hunt came up. So it's a question, and I'm not going to do the pro or con thing because I think even organizations like the International Crane Foundation have said in the past, I don't know what they're saying now, but what they've said in the past is that it's a question for science whether the crane population in this flyway can support a hunt as opposed to getting into the values of whether it's good or bad to hunt them. So I guess I'm going to go with what the Crane Foundation says. Yeah. It is. Yeah, we have a population that migrates through, like a lot of them are in the northeastern Canada and fly down through Michigan and Wisconsin. Our birds, after flying down through Wisconsin, some of them stage right around, I guess, central Wisconsin in the fall and down my way, fly southeast, and they fly over Chicago. And like if you're ever stuck in traffic in Chicago in October, look up. You'll see cranes probably. Anyway, and then they stop. They have a big staging area in northern Indiana, and they continue to Florida is where they overwinter. And then there are a couple other populations. There's one that migrates along the Rocky Mountains and another along the Pacific coast. Yeah. Yeah, let's see if we can go back to this one. So in Nebraska, when people say to me, I think I might have seen a sandhill crane, or seen a whooping crane, I'm going to get this one here. And I say, if you're not sure you saw a whooping crane, you probably didn't see one. Because there's stark difference, and it's not really even as visible here as it is when it's outside, that it's like this stark white. They're significantly larger than sandhill cranes. Their posture is kind of different where, okay, so these guys are all flying the sandhill cranes, but a sandhill crane has more of an erect posture, and if you look at a whooping crane the right way, it almost looks like they need to have front legs too, because they kind of lean forward a little bit more. And in flight, their wings flap kind of way more leisurely, sort of. So, but much bigger. Yeah. The arguments that I heard about the Keystone Pipeway focused on the Ogallala Aquifer. I'm sorry, I'm going to repeat the question. The question whether the opposition to the Keystone Pipeline included concern about affecting crane habitat. And so the arguments that I heard focused on the threat to the Ogallala Aquifer and where it underlies the sandhills, because the sandhills, of course, are sand hills, very porous soil, and therefore, especially hazardous if there were a leak. The pipeline, I think that either route that had been proposed would be east or downstream of principal crane habitat, so that probably would not have come into play. Sure. The question is about what it's like to be a volunteer at Rose Sanctuary. Well, first of all, it makes you feel kind of important because the staff, there are 5 or 6 staff members and tens of thousands of people who come there in the spring. So it's really quite clear that the operation would not be able to proceed if it were not for volunteers. The volunteers have been helping with migration since the earliest days, since the 1970s. It was volunteers who built the first couple of observation blinds. And now it's sort of like a big family. And even in years when people are not able to make it for the whole volunteer gig, they'll sometimes maybe go and stay in a hotel for a couple of days so they can hang out with their old friends. So it becomes as much about getting together with people who are like-minded individuals that you've been in this intense situation with year after year. But so let me talk a little bit about what volunteers do. If you were to phone up and make a reservation in the spring instead of doing it online, you would probably get a volunteer on the phone because they're the first line on the telephone, which means they not only have to know how to do the little volunteer system thing, they need to know about the local area so they can tell you where to stay and where you might go to see cranes if you can't get a spot in the blind, and what it's like out in the blind, and is morning better than evening, which you don't want to choose. You got to do both, incidentally. Then there are the people inside the lobby who greet you when you arrive and who answer your questions about where is it that somebody saw prairie chickens over down the road. You got to know your way around that way. They run the cash register in the gift shop. There is a staff person who does the ordering, but in terms of stocking and keeping it clean and checking you out and everything, those are all volunteers. The people who lead you out to the blinds in the morning and in the afternoon, they are volunteers. The ones who fix something when it's broken on the blind, the ones who drive the golf cart, the ones who close the gate, the ones who drive the little tour that goes around and gives the habitat tour on the trailer. So yeah, pretty much all of that. There are a few other odds and ends of things. And volunteers will drive the tour bus for for the birding excursions. I have one of my birding tour guests is here today. Pretty much they wear all hats, and it's like a big family because it's all people that are sharing the same mission. And it's something that's open to anybody, so if you feel like you're just dying to do that kind of thing, you can go online at Rose Sanctuary and find out how you can volunteer. Yes? Okay, spring and fall migration, what's the time frame? Spring migration, we have traditionally told people that it starts around Valentine's Day and peaks around St. Patrick's Day and is all gone by tax day. There are exceptions. This year was unusually early, and the birds were arriving around the beginning of February and peaked like this at the end of the first week of March. So, it might be some kind of a change in the wintering grounds or something. We're not really sure. And the birds didn't read the book, so it can vary, but that's kind of the time frame. So a 2-week period or 2-month period rather, and then about 6 weeks in between there, where the organizations that are selling spaces in a blind feel assured enough that you're going to get a good show that they're going to take your money in order to invite you to come. In the fall, it's a different matter. The birds don't really stop over on the Platte River in the fall. Couple of reasons. First of all, we're close to the end of the trip in the fall, as opposed to being close to the beginning of the trip. There's a big staging that goes on in Saskatchewan in the fall, and by the time they get to Nebraska, they're pretty much almost there, and they're in a hurry. Sometimes they'll stop over for a night, but they still don't stop on the Platte River because we still have corn in the fields at that time of year, which makes for not really good visibility and not really any place to hang out. You might see them instead farther south, like in southern Nebraska, where they have wheat crops and it's all been cleared away. And that's more like September time, September to November. Other questions? Yes. Sandhill cranes usually lay 2 eggs in a year, about the size of your fist. And in many cases, it's long been held that because of severe sibling rivalry, only one grows up. But it happens that apparently, sorry? Okay, yeah. It seems to be occurring that if the mother and father are in good health and they're experienced parents and kind of been through this thing before, and if there's plentiful food on the breeding grounds, that they'll sometimes split up Mom will take one chick, Dad will take the other, and they keep them apart so they don't, kill each other. And so they'll be able to raise 2 chicks. So in the spring, actually, during my spring migration, we still see family groups like the parents with the young of the previous year. Because people sometimes say to me, like you'll see a little flock and say, do those birds all know each other or what? If it's a big flock, no, they're just, they're maybe kind of just traveling partners. But if you see a group of 3 or a group of 4, that's probably a family unit. So they've got one or two offspring from the previous year. Yes. Question is whether cranes mate for life. The term the biologists use is long-term pair bond. So not necessarily for life, because it's kind of like with people, you start out with good intentions and things can happen. If they have trouble, for example, if they don't have reproductive success, it may happen that one partner will go off and find a different one. And of course, if one dies, they'll find another partner as well. Interesting though, just on a aside from that, when they pair up, they don't pair up for several years. So they're a few years old by the time they pair up. And in the meantime, after migration or after the spring migration, so we see the family units, mom and dad, 1 or 2 kids. Somewhere between there and the breeding grounds, the kids get the boot. Because mom and dad are getting ready to go and build another nest and start this thing over again. So what do these youngsters, because they're not ready to pair up yet, they kind of hang around in teenage gangs. So you'll sometimes see, and we see this in Wisconsin too, that during the summertime you'll see this group of cranes that look like they're really not into the whole nesting thing. And there's a bunch of them, maybe 6 or 8 birds, and they're just hanging around eating or something. And so they seem kind of aimless, and they're just growing up. And then they, eventually they're old enough to look for a mate. I don't know. I don't know if there's any laws about anything like that. I will mention they're omnivorous. So they'll eat insects and tubers and little bits of plants, and they might poke around in your yard and see if you got worms or snails down in there, or hibernating frogs or whatever. If you have cattle, they're really into cow pies. I don't know. So you got a cow pie, throw it out because the cow pies have got all kinds of really cool invertebrates in them. So they'll go along and they'll flip over a cow pie and see what's alive in there or not. And yeah, just a tip. Yeah. Well, omnivorous. So yeah, vegetable matter or like kind of anything. I've never heard of chipmunks though. Oh, yeah, no. I mean, I know I've seen them eat a frog, but I've never seen the chipmunk thing. That kind of bothers me. I've got chipmunks in my yard, but I wouldn't rule it out. Yeah, let me know if you see that again. But, yeah. Yeah. Question is like whether the cranes around here leave and come back because they seem to be hanging around a long time. We've been having that down by us too. So, you figure, well, fall is fall. Yeah, that's why it's fall migration. They should leave in the fall, and it seems not to happen. Like they lost their calendars or whatever. Although really fall ends at December 20th or something. But yeah, we've had cranes stay later and later. I've been driving off for Christmas holiday and seen cranes in the area on the ground and in the air. So whether they're extending their stay because there's more corn available, because they have learned how to exploit human habitat pretty well to their advantage, and if there's no need to leave, then they're not going to be in a big rush. Also, if the winter is fairly mild, and then wild weather, good food, they're going to hang around. But they still are going to go south and do their migration thing and then come back. But it seems like it might not be for a really long time. Yeah. Yeah, so in case you couldn't hear, there's just a photograph from Yellowstone of a sign that has a picture of a crow and says, "Nature rules, don't feed the wildlife." Um, so that reminds me, especially mentioning Yellowstone, that another thing I hadn't really thought of is that you hear this more in the context of stories about bears, that people say a fed bear is a dead bear. Because what happens is if an animal knows that it's going to get food from humans, it might hang around with humans. And so to date, I'm only aware of one state in the Eastern Flyway that allows a crane hunt, being Kentucky. There might be another one by now too. I'm not sure. And Tennessee. Okay, so, but that's kind of mixed signals we'd be giving the birds that way. Like, so that might be another thing to think about. So thanks. Yeah. Yes. They usually travel in groups. Yeah. So stuff could happen like that. Might have been what time of year? Uh huh. It could have been one that lost its mate. Yeah, or that it just kind of went astray, or even sometimes. Okay, so I don't know how far seriously lost a chick could become, but I know that in the spring sometimes we'll hear the chicks doing this really high pitched twee twee sound that's very different from the adult crane sound, because they're like calling because they lost mom and dad. So maybe they get like way lost sometimes. But I mean it sometimes happens that they just get separated, or they they lose their family members. But normally they're yeah. 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 And they probably eventually they link up with, especially if it's migration time. They know which way to go, and then they'll find other birds sooner or later. Other questions? Yes. I'm not aware of any diseases that humans can give to cranes. Yeah. Yeah, well, that would be so. Sometimes people talk about the concern that birds are going to be transmitting viruses to humans, but I don't know about the other way around. Um, I think the bigger concern would be if they're concentrated in large areas, and that wouldn't be us giving diseases to them so much as that if their habitat is really concentrated, that they might be more inclined or give diseases to each other more readily. Kind of a problem from overcrowding. Yeah. Lifespan. It kind of varies in the wild, but that people have found banded birds that were over 30 years old. They don't usually live that long. So. Okay. Well, yes, one more. They'll usually have some kind of an area that in the vernacular we call it a staging area. So it's like their traditional place where everybody sort of crowds in before they say, "Okay, let's go." And yeah, so they kind of filter in for a while. And the other thing is, like in the fall when they're doing that, they're sort of, or I guess I'm saying the spring when they're starting out, they're loading up on food. It'll be a good place where they can fatten up before they proceed. But then they're also just kind of finding each other at that point. So, well, thank you very much. I'll mention that I did bring a few books with me. If you are interested in, reading about the Platte River, and I'll be happy to autograph those for you. And otherwise, in any case, I'm so glad that you came, and I'm glad that you are interested in cranes and wanted to hear about it, and I appreciate it. Thanks.